Hello everyone, in this video we're going to talk about speciation. So by this point you should have watched a video on speciation already, and hopefully you have a good understanding of what speciation is. But before we get started with our notes, I'm going to give you a little homework and reminders. First up, homework is due Tuesday at 8:15 a.m. is the quizzes practice on speciation itself. So make sure you get it done before 8:15 a.m. and not during the break on Tuesday. Homework due on Wednesday will be your test review sheet. Make sure you get it filled out. You can get some of it done during class today, hopefully, or make sure you do get some of the questions done on Monday night so you don't have whatever 60 questions to do on Tuesday night. Most of the answers are pretty straightforward. If you do have any questions about any of the questions, make sure to look at our review page or email Miss Bai. Third point is our review page will be updated today with a bunch of Quizlets and videos. Make sure to check it out. This is your last test of the quarter. You want to get as many points as you can. A lot of the questions, as I've said before, are going to be common sense, but your common sense needs to be matched with my common sense. Lastly, there should be a test review session on Wednesday morning at 8:30 a.m. If that changes, I'll let you guys know. Maybe we'll host one online, or we're going to find out a way. If you have any questions, we'll get it settled, okay? So today we're going to talk about speciation. We're going to address questions as the following. How do we differentiate between different species, right? The word speciation means the development of different species during the process of evolution. But how can we tell two different organisms are two different species, or are they the same species? Let's find out. What is the biological species concept? So anytime we talk about the species concept is a way that scientists can identify or define two different species. So the biological species concept is one way that we can define species. So we'll take a look at that as well. What is the difference between allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation? So this is speciation event, or the event that causes different species to arise using the process of evolution. But there's a difference between these two types of speciation, and we'll talk about that as well. What keeps species distinct, right? How do we allow speciation events to happen? Okay, so first off, we're going to look at some pictures. When you look at these two types of birds, we have two types of eagles. Are they the same species, right? They look very similar to each other, but are they the same type of species? How do you know? The second one is, you see these two dogs, one very large dog and one very tiny dogs. Are these dogs the same species? How do you know, right? As you may or may not know, dogs are the same species. But how do you know? Okay, so what is speciation? Our definition for speciation is the formation of new species, right? For example, if you look at the picture below, you see this one bird, this founder species. This is your ancestor to these two different species of bird. But over time, you see different traits accumulate as a result of different mutations, maybe some genetic drift. As a reminder, a genetic drift is a chance event that causes allele frequency change, right? It causes a change in the gene pool, but it's by chance. Or it could be by natural selection or sexual selection. Sexual selection is mates selecting each other, and that could lead to certain individuals having offsprings and other individuals not being able to have offsprings. Okay, so all these natural selection, sexual selection, genetic drift, mutations can happen to these two populations of birds individually. So over time, they accumulate enough differences that they eventually can become two different species. So now it will be a good time for you to pause the video and write down your notes. So there are two types of speciation based on where it happens. So the first type is called allopatric speciation. So allo means other, meaning that this two species are able to evolve and become two different species due to their location. They're separated from each other. So if you read the definition, it says it involves geographic separation of populations from a parent species and subsequent evolution. So basically you have two groups of individuals, two groups of populations, and they're geographically separated from each other. And that could lead to independent, as we said, mutations, natural selection, genetic drift, and sexual selection, and many other factors. All of these can accumulate and allow these two populations to become two different species. However, speciation doesn't have to happen when the two populations are separated. You can also have speciation event happening while the two populations are at the same locations, while they could still meet each other. So that is called sympatric speciation. Sim means same, so this involves speciation occurring within a parent species remaining in one location, right? So we have our one parent species, these two bird populations can still be at the same location, but that could still lead to two different species. Today we're going to focus more on the allopatric speciation part, and you'll learn more about sympatric speciation in AP Bio when you come to AP Bio in a few years. So the biological species concept is one way that we can define two different species. So in this method, we say that a species is members of the same species, right? They can potentially interbreed or mate, meaning that they can mate, right, with one another to produce a viable, fertile offspring. We're missing an A right here. So the important part for you to focus on is interbreed, viable, and fertile offspring. So what we mean is that if two individuals can interbreed, and normally when interbreed happens, an offspring is produced, right? But when we're talking about speciation, we want to make sure that this offspring that is produced, first off, has to be alive, right, and healthy. And then this individual itself, this offspring, can also be fertile, meaning that this offspring, this F1 generation, can produce the next generation, this F2 generation. And it has to go on. The F2 has to be able to produce the F3 generation, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that if you think about dogs, for example, right, no matter what size of a dog you have, if we breed two dogs, no matter what kind of breed it is, they're going to be able to produce generally a living and healthy offspring that can also produce the next generation of offspring. So we define dogs as the same species. But there's also another word called a hybrid. So a hybrid is an offspring of two different species. For example, a mule. A mule is a hybrid because it is a cross between a horse and a donkey, right? So this is what we call a hybrid. However, we say that a horse and a donkey are two different species based on the biological species concept. The reason for that is because this mule, although it's viable, it's fertile, it's viable, but it's not fertile, right? It's alive, but it's not able to have more offspring. So we're saying that horses and donkeys are two different species based on the biological species concept. Okay, so the next one is called reproductive isolation. When we have two species that cannot produce a viable, fertile offspring, we're saying that these two species have what we call a reproductive isolation. They're isolated in terms of reproductive methods. They cannot produce an offspring that's viable, right? So what is reproductive isolation? It's simply when two organisms cannot reproduce and form a viable, fertile offspring, right? If you look at these frog cartoons on the bottom, we have these two frogs, and just because they're sitting on two lotus leaves, they cannot produce an offspring that's alive. That's all it is. If they can't produce an offspring that's viable and fertile, then they're two different species. According to the biological species concept, there are other ways that we can define what a species is and how we can differentiate between two different species, and we actually need to look at all the evidence, but this is only one method that we're going to learn about in our class. What type of isolation leads to the formation of new species? How can this happen, right? When you look at these two species, what is preventing the two from becoming one? So there are three different types of reproductive isolation, of how reproductive isolation can develop. The first one is called behavioral isolation. The second one is called geographic isolation or habitat isolation. The third one is called temporal isolation, and we'll address each one of them. But before we move on, when populations become reproductively isolated, right? Reproductively isolated meaning they again, cannot produce a viable fertile offspring, they can evolve into two separate species, right? If they can't reproduce together, according to the biological species concept, they're two different species. So the first one is called the behavioral isolation. Hopefully, okay, hold on. Let me, okay, we're not going to watch this video, but basically the behavioral isolation, if you want to watch the video, this PowerPoint is going to be posted on our shared drive. You can take a look if you want to look at some dances by these birds. So basically, what is a behavioral isolation? It is a difference in behavior, right? If you think about birds, for example, they have these courtship dance or mating dance, and most birds have songs that they sing. If the behavior of two organisms, of two populations, are different, they're not going to mate. But the idea is, if you don't see eye to eye with another organism, that is not going to work out, right? So for behavioral isolation, we have mating behaviors such as courtship or songs is different between different species. So if you look at these birds, on the bottom, on the left side, we have these birds that have a certain style of dance, and on the right side, that's a different style of dance, right? If the left population meets the right population, they're not going to mate, simply because they're not even going to try to mate, right? Because they don't recognize each other's dances. It's yucky for them to look at each other in the eye. And they go, I don't know what you're doing. Why are you being weird, right? So another example is we have finches at the Galapagos Island. These finches are birds. They have different songs that individuals of the same species can recognize or respond to, and other species cannot. They've accumulated so much difference due to, again, mutations, genetic drift, sexual selection, and we have our regular natural selection. They've accumulated so much difference that their songs have become so different that they can no longer recognize each other, even if they tried and they're able to produce a viable fertile offspring. They won't even try to have an offspring in the first place. So that's called a behavioral isolation. There's a difference in their behavior, such as their courtship or songs, right? So you can look at these birds, right? Their dance is very different from each other. Look how beautiful. Birds are so beautiful. Okay, so here we have the western meadowlark and the eastern, their songs are different. Okay, the next one is called geographical isolation. Geographical isolation, or habitat isolation, is when two species are physically separated, and because they're physically separated, they can't mate. They won't be able to see each other. They're too far away, right? But this kind of physical barrier is different for different species, right? Think about the Grand Canyon, for example. We can have squirrels on one side of the Grand Canyon and squirrels on the other side. The chance of the two populations of squirrels to meet each other is very low because they're too far away and they're not able to run all the way down from one side of the canyon to the other side. However, if you were to be a bird, this is not so big of a problem, right? So you have to remember, for geographical isolation, whether this barrier is a barrier or not, depending on what kind of species you are and how you travel and how far you travel and so on. So a geographical barrier can separate two populations, right? They're physically separated. After natural selection and genetic drift and other factors, mutations, sexual selection, more and more other factors, they act on each individual population separately. And that leads to reproductive isolation, right? They've accumulated so much difference because they're geographically separated that even if they met and they were to try to mate, they won't be able to produce a viable fertile offspring. An example would be the Abert squirrel and the Kabaib squirrel. I'm sure I'm pronouncing this wrong, but hopefully you get the idea. We have these two species of squirrels on two sides of the canyon, and they can't meet each other. And because this the river is forming in between, I think that's a river. The river is formed in between the canyons. They can't travel to the other side. And since it's been so long since the two populations have met and tried to mate, that they've accumulated so much difference that they eventually become two different species. Same idea on the right side, but a complete different type of organism. We have fish right here. This is near the Caribbean. We have this Isthmus of Panama. This part of land actually wasn't there millions of years ago. So in the past, the fish were able to travel back and forth and continue to mix up the genes and allowing the gene pool to expand and allowing the genes to mix up with each other, right? So if the genes keep on getting mixed up, then it's less likely that they're going to become two different species. But then because of this physical barrier, these two different fish populations accumulated a lot of differences genetically and physically that they become two different species. And even if they try to mate today, they won't be able to produce a viable fertile offspring, so we define them as two different species. So this next part is our squirrels in the Grand Canyon, right? As we said before. And we have these little tiny squirrels. They're so cute. Okay, lastly, we have something called a temporal isolation. So when you think about the word temporal, it's not about, it's not the shrimp tempura. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the seasons or the time of the day. So temporal isolation occurs when two or more species reproduce at different time of the day or different seasons. So if they're reproducing at different time of the day, right? One is a morning person, one is a night owl kind of frog or whatever other type of organism it is, crickets. They're not going to be able to mate because they're not awake at the same time, right? They're not trying to mate at the same time, and that's not going to work out for these two populations. And eventually, again, they're going to accumulate so much difference between the two populations that they're going to become two different species. Or instead of different time of the day, we can have different seasons, right? If you look on the right, we have these toads that mate in the summer, and toads or early summer, and toads that mate in the late summer. They don't come in contact in terms of their breeding time. So that's what temporal isolation is. Here's some vocabulary as a review. We learn about speciation. We learn about reproductive isolation. What is that? Do you know it? We have a test on Wednesday. Hopefully you paid enough attention that you know it. It's not particularly difficult, I promise. We have allopatric speciation, where speciation event happens when two populations are geographically separated. And we have sympatric speciation. We have a zygote. So a zygote is a fertilized egg. Sometimes it can be produced, sometimes it cannot. And when they cannot be produced at all between two populations, they're probably two different species according to the biological species concept. We have a pre-zygotic barrier. Oh, this is not addressed in our video at all. I'm so sorry. So a pre-zygotic barrier is when two species cannot even produce a zygote. So let's say the three kinds that we talked about, the behavior isolation, geographical isolation, and temporal isolation, these two populations won't even come into contact and try to make a zygote or allow a zygote to be successfully formed. That is called a pre-zygotic barrier. And we have post-zygotic barrier is like the mule situation, where even if a zygote is produced, this offspring is viable, but this offspring is not fertile. That's generally what a post-zygotic barrier is. And we have behavioral isolation. We did learn temporal isolation, geographic isolation, habitat isolation. Lastly, there's a video that you're welcome to watch at home. It's going to be posted on our review page. If you're not 100% sure about what you learned today, you can watch this video. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. I'll hope to see you tomorrow. Make sure you get your homework done. If you're missing any homework, please check your Veracross. I'm going to send out some homework reminders to make sure that you're making up what you need to make up within this week. Have a wonderful day. Bye.